I'm just back from an amazing wildlife photography safari, and this video series is one you're not going to want to miss. In this video, I'm focusing on three aspects: wildlife photography camera settings, the lessons I learned, and the animal sightings on my first safari game drive, with photo examples throughout. This series of videos is going to be based on my amazing trip to the Kruger National Park in South Africa, and I'll be showing you a series of images and galleries and videos from my trip there. And this is the first in a series of videos I'll be making from this what was a most amazing and wonderful trip. Future videos will cover such things as the photographic techniques, the animal sightings from the big five through to the lion pride, the post-kill of the lions. So many birds, absolutely phenomenal. So I'll include a number of different videos going forward. So please remember to hit that like and subscribe button and turn those notifications on so you find out when I actually upload those videos. I'm Andy and welcome to my channel. If you've not seen any of my previous videos, I'm a photographer just really sharing my passion for all things photographic, and this trip was so special I really wanted to share it through a number of videos. So without further ado, first things first, let's go through the camera settings that I had at the beginning of my first game drive. Then we'll cover the game drive and then the lessons that I learned from this that I can carry forward into the future videos. So my go-to camera settings were to utilize manual mode. My default shutter speed was 1/1600th of a second, and I used the wide open aperture, so I set the default on my lens that I generally used was the 100 to 500, so I set it down to f4.5. If I extended the lens out to 500, it would go to f7, but as soon as I retracted to say 100mm, it would drop back to f4.5. And then I set it to auto ISO. So I let the camera do the evaluation of the scene for me in this scenario. Now, so that I could really quickly get this, I set this up as a custom mode on my camera so that it was fixed. That meant that I wanted to change any of those settings, which I often did on location, I could actually very quickly, by switching the dial off of custom mode 2 and back onto custom mode 2, it would reset my camera to those settings so that I could start again. And I'll explain a little bit later in my learnings how I would change those settings on location. I then duplicated these settings onto custom mode 3 because my camera, the R7, has 3 custom modes. So what I would do was I duplicated it into custom mode 3, but what I then did was use the electronic shutter. Same settings for everything else, but just add the electronic shutter. This meant that I could go into burst mode really quickly through the menus, especially for birds in flight. It was invaluable for those. And for shooting, I actually used back button focus. I disconnected focus from the shutter release button and just let it do the metering. I did use evaluative metering throughout, but I have the histogram on the screen so that I can assess that and whether I want to do any exposure compensation. I didn't bracket at all, but I did use exposure compensation through the control ring on the lens, and that's something I'll talk about again in the lessons learned further on. Okay, so now we've kind of set the scene with how I set up the camera initially. I'll go through the game drive and I'll go through what we saw on this very first game drive. Some of the other videos will contain a lot more wildlife as well, but there were some great first initial sightings, enough for me to get ridiculously excited at times. But then I will also go through some of the learnings that I applied to some of my future photography on the safari, and also what I applied on future game drives. Okay, so without further ado, let's crack on with my first game drive. I'll do these images in the order in which we were capturing them on the actual game drive, in the order of the sightings that we had. The weather was also a little bit overcast and a little bit rainy, so maybe we brought that from the UK, I don't know, but of course that helped in my camera settings because the auto ISO could really adjust the exposure for that condition. So the first sighting that we had was actually of a herd of impalas, and they were in the thickets, the fallen and dead trees, probably felled by elephants, and there'll be more of that a little bit later on. But what I really noticed was this herd of impalas amongst the trees. It was kind of tempting initially just to get the image, just get that image, and we've got an image of an impala, move on. Actually, my first big learning when photographing these was actually two things. One was getting the animal or the bird in context of the natural environment, and the second one was actually getting the detail. So I noticed in the impala, one of them was right in the depths of the dead trees, and the dead branches framed its head brilliantly, and I really enjoyed getting the detail on that. The second big lesson that I really learnt just right on this first sighting was actually trying to predict what the animals were going to do. So here, because this was my first experience, I just missed the impala jumping out of the dead trees. Just managed to get an image, but it isn't very well framed. It just cut off the top, and that was because I wasn't that experienced at this point in predicting the actual jump of the impala. And you'll see in some of my future videos that hopefully there are improvements in those. So this is where I really learnt to understand, to observe the animals, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my general learnings a little bit later, very shortly. And our next sighting was an elephant. This was a lone bull elephant, but it was quite deep into the thickets. So based on my experience of the impalas, what I decided to do was really zoom in on the detail, because trying to get the elephant in its entirety, and we were quite close to it, but trying to get the elephant in the entirety, there were so many bushes and everything in the way, but he was busy feeding, and I felt that this was really good time to get that animal behavior. So what I've done with these images is zoom in on his feeding behavior, and then what I noticed was we could really get into the detail of his eye as well, which I just found fascinating. But actually it's quite hard to get I noticed it was really hard to get the elephant's eye. It's got such thick eyelashes that it's really difficult to get the detail on that. The other thing that I really noticed whilst we were there was that there was a drongo, a fan-tailed drongo, just on a branch right behind it, but it never came to settle on the actual elephant. So I quite like, though, the idea that this is just on the branch behind the elephant, watching the elephant feed. And again, it was that idea of getting the detail when you actually can't get the context because of the complexity of the environment that the actual elephant was within. And our next sight, it was a lioness. This was absolutely magical. This is one of the advantages. If you go to something like the Kruger National Park, you cannot leave the roads. Because we were in West Oliphants, which is part of Greater Kruger, no sighting can have more than 2 vehicles at any one sighting, and you'll see from one of my future videos that there are so many cars in Kruger. And it was true off-roading. Although there are trails, dirt trails through the bushlands, actually when we got there it was absolutely just off-road. And we got really close, and the lioness was very chilled, not disrupted in any way, and was just walking around the car and down the tracks and through the bush. Absolutely amazing. So what I wanted to do with this was get a series of images that really got the calmness, and really, because she was so close, I really wanted to get into the detail of the lioness herself. So what I'm going to do here is, rather than show you and talk over all of the images, I'm just going to show you the gallery of the lioness images. And the last one of just the eyes, I think really gives a real insight into the lioness. And then it became very dusky. The sun started to set, it was overcast, so the light was getting worse and worse as we progressed. But it was a sunset game drive, although it was incredibly cloudy. So we didn't see the sunset, we just saw lots of clouds. But what we saw sitting on a post in the gloom was this brown-headed kingfisher, absolutely beautiful. And this was my next big lesson, which I'd kind of done through my settings anyway. It pushed the ISO right up to 12,800, so it was really taking it to its limits. But this is the processed file that I'm showing you now, where I have used Adobe denoise and just brought out the colours that existed within it. And this is the power of not being too afraid to push your ISO for wildlife photography. And after the sun had set, we continued to do a night game drive, which involved the use of spotlights to try and identify the reflection in the animals and the birds' eyes, which worked brilliantly. And at this point we spotted a hyena. It was a female hyena. She did have a couple of cubs just in the background, but we couldn't really see those because they were in one of the small little drainage ditches. But she was lit by our car spotlight, and also there was a second car back in line with what I said earlier, no more than 2 cars at any sighting. But that created a fantastic crossover of the 2 spotlights on the hyena. And the spotlights that are used are not harsh, they're very soft in their tone, and so they don't disrupt the animals, other than the fact that they do look at where the light source is coming from. But it created, because we had the 2 cars, a fantastic crossover. And it created this shadow on the bank behind the hyena to really give it that, I don't know what the word is, it gave it a real atmosphere. And I think you'll agree that in these images, it really brings about what we were seeing at that particular point in time. You've got the great colours of the hyena, the shape of the hyena, and then you've got the shadow cast onto the bank behind, and the way that the light arcs through it is just, in my mind, it makes for an amazing composition. So on this first game drive we saw some absolutely fascinating wildlife and wildlife behaviour. We only saw 2 of the big 5. My next video is going to be photographing the big 5 of South Africa. So please turn those notifications on and you'll get notified of when I upload that video. In terms of the lessons learned, there was just so many that I learned. The first one was I increased my ISO from 12,800 to 25,600. I concluded that pushing the ISO to this amount could actually be catered for in the images, especially using Adobe denoise in post-production. One of the other big learnings for me as well was that I tended to use the 100 to 500 quite a lot, and that restricted, or it gave me absolutely fantastic range and reach, but what it actually did was restrict my ability sometimes to get the creatures, the animals, the birds in context of the landscape. So what I would do, this is the advantage of having 2 camera bodies, I would use the 18 to 150 on the R10 and swap camera bodies. Now I appreciate not everybody can do this, but what I would say is don't be afraid to change lenses when on a game drive. It's important to, when photographing wildlife and doing wildlife photography, it's critical to be able to capture the landscape. And certainly the next time I go, I'm also going to go down to my 10 to 18 as well, so that I can capture the whole landscape and the vista with the animals in context. One of my elephant encounters in a future video will include images taken with the 10 to 18. Another key thing when on location is also, first thing is to get the image, get the first image. At the end of the day, a lot of us will do photography because we want to have memories of our trip. We're not necessarily going to be out there to be professionals. So what my approach to this was to get the image first as a memoir of the game drive or the wildlife that I'm observing at that particular point. And then it allowed me to then become a bit more creative, drop the shutter speed down, increase the aperture, change the composition. But I got that initial shot that was the critical one. That's the memory for the trip. And then what I've got is a series of more creative shots that follow on from that single subject, zooming in on the detail, getting the animal in context, etc. And that's a particularly great technique to use because it allows you to become a little bit more creative on location. And one thing that I learned almost immediately was to use the viewfinder and keep viewing through the viewfinder, not the screen, the actual viewfinder. In my case it's electronic, or you may have an optical viewfinder. And right back to my first image of the impala, that is a great example where if I'd have been using the viewfinder much more actively and predicting the animal, I would have caught that image of the impala jumping out of the tree. So learning the behaviors of the animals and using the viewfinder to predict the movement of the subject, to predict its behaviors so that you can get those really different images. And that is something that I practice throughout all of my different wildlife photography experiences on this trip. One of the biggest learnings was actually the use of exposure compensation. This is actually fundamental to getting great detail in the subject. So if your subject's particularly dark, then you need to increase your exposure. If your subject is particularly light, so for example you've got white areas on the subject, you need to bring that exposure down a little bit, either 1 or 2 stops, either way, to get a good exposure. I hope you've really enjoyed this. I hope it's proven useful. Please drop any comments down below on your settings. Have I missed anything? And also any lessons that I haven't explained here very well. If you've got any questions, just drop those down below as well. And also I hope that it's inspired you to get out and maybe help improve your photography. I know that my wildlife photography improved dramatically during the course of this trip, and I hope that that's reflected in the future videos that I'll be making. Please remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and also check out these videos next. Thank you very much for your time in watching this video, and until next time, thank you and see you soon.